This is where the story gets really, really ugly. His body was desecrated. His head was severed and displayed on a pike in Plymouth for over 20 years. I don't know. Imagine the scene, walking into Plymouth every day and seeing somebody's head on a pole. Welcome back to Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. B. Today we're going to be exploring a story of resistance and reconnection. About a week and a half ago, right around Thanksgiving, I released an episode talking about the Wampanoag, the people of the First Light. This is the tribe that first came in contact with the separatists, also known as the Pilgrims. And a lot of people were asking me, well, what happened to the Wampanoag? And so I wanted to do a follow-up episode and talk about the fate of Metacom, who was the leader of the Wampanoag. He's the son of Massasoit. And I want to talk about the King Philip's War, or what is referred to as King Philip's War, and discuss what happened to Metacom, his wife, and his son, and his people during and after King Philip's War. And this just isn't about war. It's also about a people's struggle for survival and the devastating consequences of colonialism. And of course, the enduring connections that have persisted across centuries. And we'll discuss the brutality of the war itself, the horrifying aftermath for Metacom and his family, and how the descendants of those forcibly removed are reconnecting today. And it really is an amazing story. This is a story of resistance, culture, and the unbreakable bonds of kinship. So let's jump in. I'll start by giving you some context. So by the mid-1600s, indigenous peoples in New England were under increasing pressure by the English settlers, starting with the separatists and eventually the Puritans, who had expanded their towns and claimed more land, more territory, and started to impose their will, their laws, their way of life onto the indigenous communities who had been on the East Coast for centuries. The Wampanoag, led by Metacom's father, Massasoit, had initially did his best to maintain peace with the settlers. And by the time Metacom became a leader, this was around 1662, the settlers' demands were becoming absolutely relentless, and it was becoming more difficult for Metacom, the Wampanoag, and other tribes in New England to be able to maintain their autonomy and their sovereignty. So land was effectively stolen, cultural practices were suppressed through these so-called praying towns, which is a sad story in and of itself. I'd love to do an episode on the praying towns and how they were assimilating Native Americans into Christianity, which I think a lot of people know about forced assimilation policies, but the praying towns is a whole nother story that I think needs to be unpacked. So in a different episode, we'll tackle that. And of course, I just want to get into what the Wampanoag were doing to try to survive this, because Massasoit, the leader of the Pokanoket, the Wampanoag, had done his best to maintain peace and also to keep Pokanoket Wampanoag culture alive. And so that was his goal. And he was able to keep the peace for nearly 40 years, but he eventually passes away and his sons take the reign. And of course, the breaking point for the Wampanoag comes in 1675 after settlers had accused 3 Wampanoag men for allegedly murdering a Christianized native. And again, at this time, the Puritans were setting up praying towns, and they were doing their best to assimilate Native Americans and to Christianize these communities. So this injustice ignited what is called King Philip's War, or more appropriately, Metacom's War. And you might be thinking, well, who's King Philip? Well, this is what they called Metacom. Metacom was referred to as King Philip by the English. So whenever he went to the English court to discuss any type of dispute or to discuss giving up more territory, they referred to him as King Philip. Let's talk a little bit about the war. So this was brutal on both sides. Metacom had united several tribes, obviously in a desperate attempt to push English settlers out of their lands. And like I said, over the years, more and more territories were being appropriated, were being taken. And it really just got to the point to where the Wampanoag weren't really given a choice to give up lands. They were basically being told to give up territories that had belonged to them, again, for centuries. So for a time during the war, Native Americans on the East Coast were very successful in not just attacking settlements, but in some cases, completely driving settlers back towards the shores. But the tide of the war ends up turning as the English bring in reinforcements. And one of the big advantages that Europeans have is that they have an endless flow of people who are coming from Europe. And they have an endless flow of military resources as well. But even though the Wampanoag and their allies were successful, the English do retaliate, and entire indigenous communities are destroyed. Thousands of men, women, and children are displaced. Well over 1,000 are killed, enslaved, or displaced. And the enslavement of Native Americans is something that I had learned about much later. I always knew about American slavery, even though we don't teach it in schools. We understand that Africans were enslaved, but there was a slave trade involving Native Americans going back all the way to 1492. And unfortunately, during this time, indigenous people along the Atlantic coast are being kidnapped, are being convicted of petty crimes, and then being sold off into slavery and shipped to some of these colonies. So anyway, there's more to that story that I want to get into. But entire villages are completely destroyed. Thousands of people on both sides are affected by the war. And it's really one of the bloodiest, most violent conflicts in early colonial America. For Metacom and his people, the cost was really unimaginable, and the horror didn't end with the war itself. So in August of 1676, Metacom was betrayed, he was tracked down, and he was killed by English forces. This is where the story gets really, really ugly. His body was desecrated. His head was severed and displayed on a pike in Plymouth for over 20 years. I don't know, imagine the scene, walking into Plymouth every day and seeing somebody's head on a pole. This is actual history. This actually happened. So it's a grim warning to other Native Americans that if you go against the English, you go against the separatists and the Puritans, this is what's going to happen to you. And also other parts of his body were cut off and were sent out as war trophies. The fate of his wife and his son was no less devastating. So Metacom's son, he was just 12 years old or around 12, and his wife were captured. They were imprisoned initially, and eventually they were sold into slavery in Bermuda. And this was part of a broader strategy by colonial powers to sever Native families and completely erase their identities. And this had been going on even before the separatist so-called Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. European so-called explorers were going up and down the Atlantic coast, kidnapping Native Americans and placing them in bondage and selling them at slave markets. And so this This history is a brutal one, absolutely brutal one. So the story of their enslavement, like I said, it's a dark chapter in colonial history. In Bermuda, indigenous captives like Metacom's family are forced into really brutal conditions. But there's a bunch of stories of resistance. There's one, his name is Indian John. He's a Wampanoag who is sold off into slavery, and he resists enslavement in Bermuda. And the stories of his resistance still live on to this day. And unfortunately, Indian John is eventually captured after he attempts to escape, and he's executed. But it does highlight the resistance of indigenous communities that's been buried. And so there's an attempt to not just destroy indigenous communities, but to completely annihilate their identity. But these stories live on, which is really, it's an amazing part of this history here. And generations of Metacom's descendants and other enslaved indigenous communities in Bermuda were able to maintain their identity, in some cases in secrecy. So their stories survive through oral traditions, and even as official records were attempting to erase their identities, they were able to keep their indigenous culture alive, even far away from their homeland. And that is a part of the story that I didn't know. I knew what happened to Metacom. I knew that he was eventually captured, that he was executed, that he was decapitated, that they desecrated his body. I knew that his son, his wife were eventually sold off in slavery. But I never knew what happened to them. And it was really incredible for me to find out that the Wampanoag identity was able to stay alive through all these centuries of oppression. Incredibly, the Wampanoag are able to survive hundreds of years of settler colonial policies that were aimed to completely erase their history here in the United States. Equally amazing is that the people who are shipped off into slavery to Bermuda were also able to keep aspects of Wampanoag culture alive. And there had been efforts to do the research to find out where these people were sent to, and also to see if any of those descendants were still alive. And they are still alive, and there has been reconnection efforts. One example is Bermuda St. David's Reconnection Day. This event started back in 2002, and it's a gathering that brings together Native people from New England and their relatives that are sold off into slavery in Bermuda. And of course, it's a time to honor their shared history, to exchange traditions, and to rebuild the bonds that colonialism had attempted to eradicate. And what's really amazing is that the Wampanoag who are sold into slavery during this horrible period of oppression, they're able to keep their culture alive. They're able to keep their indigenous identity alive. And that part of the story just blows me away. The story of Metacom, what happens to his wife, his child being sold off into slavery, the near destruction of the Pokanoket, the Wampanoag, the people of the First Light, is definitely a tragic story, but it's also a story of indigenous resistance. Despite decades and years of war, of conflict, cultural suppression, the Wampanoag and other tribes were able to keep their culture alive. And I think that's something that we should obviously be celebrating. These stories are also incredibly powerful because they give us an alternative view of history. And if you live in a settler colonial country like the US or Canada, you're often given a history that completely erases indigenous narratives. And that's the whole point of settler colonialism. It's to occupy the land, to steal the resources, and to erase indigenous identities. These histories should also be a reminder of the ongoing struggles that all Indigenous communities face today here in 2024 to keep their cultures alive, to maintain their traditions. After 500 years of colonialism, Indigenous communities are still faced with the challenges of maintaining healthy community ties. As we remember Metacom, his wife, and his son, and all the people who had their lives turned upside down through this process of settler colonialism, let's honor their legacy, not just through learning the history, but also supporting Indigenous sovereignty today. All right, thank you for joining me on this journey through some really incredible history, and I'm really curious. I want to know your thoughts, so feel free to comment in the comment section. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Dr. B Teaches. Also, this podcast can be found on all major platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast. Just search 7th Generation Podcast. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, my handle is 7gen Podcast. And if you're into TikTok as well, you can find me there. Just search for Merciless Savages. I enjoy bringing you this content. And if there's something that you want to learn, something that is unclear in this episode, feel free to comment in the comment section, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have. Keep learning, keep educating yourself, and we'll be back real soon. Later.